Tonight on 16 by 9, they escape with their lives.
My family was targeted and I was threatened with death.
Now the government wants to crack down.
You would say that's a smuggling operation.
Will Canada send them to their deaths?
We are sending them back to be slaughtered.
And then taking to the ice with the best in the world.
I think he's the greatest skater that's ever been.
Here's Carolyn Jarvis.
When nearly 600 Sri Lankan migrants came to Canada aboard battered freighters, their reception was far from that of the typical refugee. Labeled suspected terrorists and criminals, what followed was an intense political debate. On one side, the federal government, which claims Canada has become a doormat for bogus refugee claims and is about to introduce sweeping legislation to change that. On the other, refugee advocates who say Canada is turning away from its tradition of compassion. Tonight, first-hand accounts from people who made that dangerous ocean journey and the controversy that met them on shore.
It's hard to imagine how a sunny, peaceful scene like this could give a man nightmares. But this man, who we'll call Kumar, is constantly haunted by the war he fled and the sea voyage that almost killed him.
Thinking back about the events, I'm not able to recover from the traumatic experience and unable to collect myself and move on.
Kumar is an ethnic Tamil from Sri Lanka, now claiming refugee status in Canada. He asked us to hide his identity to protect his family back home.
To save our lives, we had to flee our home to escape from heavy shelling.
In late 2008, Kumar says he and his family were forced to flee their home as the army pushed its brutal war with the rebel Tamil Tigers to an end. To this day, the Sri Lankan government denies targeting civilians, but last year the UN released a report citing credible evidence of deliberate bombing in areas packed with civilians. 16 by 9 obtained this rare video from inside the war zone that appears to show innocent people fleeing the carnage. The sound of the bombers is etched in Kumar's mind.
And when I hear the airplanes flying over here in Canada, I'm reminded of the grim memories.
During the war, captured Tamil Tigers were routinely killed, their bodies publicly displayed. Kumar says he himself was accused of being an enemy combatant and beaten by government soldiers. So he says he did the only thing he could think of. He escaped to Thailand, got on a ship, along with 75 other desperate people.
At times, the sea was really rough, and I felt saddened that if I die during this journey, my parents would not find my body.
That ship was called the Ocean Lady, and it would soon become very familiar to Canadians. For 45 days, the rusty freighter was pummeled by storms, its human cargo sick, scared, and fearing the end.
Given all the incidents during the journey, I never thought reaching ashore was at all possible.
On October 17, 2009, the voyage finally ended when Canadian Navy and police boats intercepted the ship off the coast of Vancouver Island. Kumar spent his first 5 months in Canada in a medium security prison. 2 years later, he is still waiting and hoping his refugee claim will be accepted.
Happiness would be for my refugee claim to be accepted and reunite with my family here. That would be the ultimate happiness.
But all the while, his mind still drifts back to Sri Lanka.
While I'm safe here, my family continues to live there, and I continue to be concerned about their safety.
As a journalist back in Sri Lanka, this man, who we'll call Coogan, knows how scary life there can be, especially for those who speak out.
If I bring a situation to light, my life would be in danger the next moment. I met a journalist, and half-hour later, he was killed.
It wasn't long until his life and the lives of his loved ones were in danger too. That's when he decided to leave.
My family was targeted, and I was threatened with death.
Coogan says all he wants is to live in freedom with his family.
This country is governed by a government that works for the people, but this model is non-existent in our country.
So he decided to pay $45,000 to be smuggled into Canada aboard the Ocean Lady. Financial arrangements like that don't sit well with this man. James Bissett is the former head of the Canadian Immigration Service. He says organized criminals have learned there's easy money to be made from Canada's lenient refugee laws.
We've really become the target of choice for international human smuggling because anyone coming to Canada who simply claims to be persecuted is allowed in.
Coogan admits he knew he was breaking the law, but says he was desperate.
While I ask the people to understand our situation, I would also like to apologize to the people of Canada.
It was not a joy trip for them. They were forced to, in order to save their lives.
Sam Nagendra came to Canada from Sri Lanka in the 1980s and has been working as an immigration consultant ever since. He worked with some of the Ocean Lady survivors and heard their horrific stories.
The most senior lady who was there, she was about 76 years old. What made you make this trip on this boat? And the answer that she said was, it's better sink in the ocean than being killed by the Sri Lankan army. They had lost their parents, they had lost their siblings, bombed and killed, and they did not have the time even to bury their dead. They had to leave the bodies and run.
He knows many Canadians weren't happy with how the Tamils got here, but says sometimes the decision to get on a boat is simply a matter of life and death.
Say you are living in a 10-storied building, and your building is on fire. You are going to jump. You're not waiting in line. You're going to get burnt and killed.
Next on 16 by 9, they came seeking compassion, but got accusations instead.
Suspected terrorists and human smugglers on this boat.
Now, will new laws punish the victims?
August 13th, 2010, less than a year after the Ocean Lady landed on Canadian shores with 76 Tamils seeking asylum, another migrant ship arrives off Canada's west coast. As the sun rises, the media frenzy begins.
And the federal government promises to be tough on these migrants.
Arrival of the migrants here on Vancouver Island has prompted many questions. Exactly who are they?
The MV Sunsea had more than 492 more Tamils on board, but this time the feds had a plan. Before the boat arrived in Vancouver, the government PR machine kicked into high gear, led by Public Safety Minister Vic Taves.
Suspected terrorists and human smugglers on this boat.
It's something that will not be tolerated in our country.
Suspected human smugglers and terrorists, human smuggling and human trafficking is not acceptable.
Former chair of Canada's Immigration and Refugee Board, Peter Scholler.
Minister of Public Safety, Vic Taves, was repeating terrorists, Tamil taggers, human smugglers, traffickers.
And that, Scholler says, was nothing more than a government-mounted political smear campaign.
They didn't say any of the other part of the story, that there has been a long, vicious war in Sri Lanka.
After surviving that war and getting to Canada on the Ocean Lady, refugee claimant Kumar says the accusations still sting.
It hurt us as we were not in any way affiliated with terrorism, and blanket branding continues to impact us negatively.
Meanwhile, the Sun Sea was being searched, migrants were being detained in correctional centers in Vancouver's eastern suburbs, and the government's PR offensive was just getting started.
Are these measures tough? Yes, undoubtedly. Because in order to make human smugglers and fraudsters think twice, they have to be.
Only 2 months after the arrival of the Sun Sea, Minister Taves stood in front of the Ocean Lady, flanked by Immigration Minister Jason Kenney and former Public Safety Minister Stockwell Day, and announced plans to crack down on human smuggling.
But they are also fair. Fair to those who legitimately and legally wait or have waited in line for a better life in Canada.
That ship was their symbolic gold mine. 1 year later, now on the election trail, Prime Minister Stephen Harper was talking tough about smuggling.
Canadians can choose between a Liberal NDP Bloc Québécois coalition that would turn a blind eye to this type of criminal activity, or a government that believes Canada should welcome and reward those who play by the rules.
Rules his government, now with majority power, is set to change with this new legislation. It's called Bill C-31, and it's packed with strict new regulations. People convicted of helping organize a smuggling event now face minimum jail terms of up to 10 years to go along with the existing maximum sentence of life. But proposed new laws don't just target the smugglers, they target the smuggled as well. If the laws pass, asylum seekers can be put in detention for a year with no review if they arrive in a group. That designation is up to the minister. Members of those groups now lose the right to appeal if their refugee claim is rejected, and even if their claim is accepted, they have to wait 5 years to apply for permanent residency. During that time, they can't apply to bring their families to Canada or travel outside the country. Scholler says the bill targets the wrong people.
They talk about human smugglers, but who they're punishing are the smuggled, not the smugglers. We're going to mandatorily detain you for a year. We're not going to let you see your families for 7 or 8 years. Candidly, it's extraordinary. It's a blatant violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights.
And it's not the first time we've grappled with this issue. At the height of World War II, Canada turned away the SS St. Louis, a ship with 907 Jews fleeing the Nazis. They were forced to go back to Europe, and 254 eventually died in the Holocaust. Today, a haunting memorial stands at Pier 21 in Halifax, where the ship would have landed. Peter Scholler fears Bill C-31 heralds another dark chapter for Canada's treatment of refugees.
Canadians will be ashamed, and I fervently hope they will be ashamed in advance and deny the government the authority to do this, rather than looking at this 10 or 15 years later and listening to a Prime Minister standing up in Parliament to apologize.
Next on 16 by 9, securing borders or closing doors.
It's going to be disaster, and I think it's going to be a shame on Canada.
They fled a deadly civil war in Sri Lanka, with untold casualties, war crimes on both sides, and civilians trapped in the middle. Nearly 600 Tamil asylum seekers fled to Canada on 2 boats, hoping for a better life in this country. Instead, their arrival sparked a political backlash.
What this government does is create a boogeyman of the bogus refugee.
Former Immigration and Refugee Board Chair Peter Scholler says the the Conservative government has damaged Canada's reputation for compassion.
The phony refugee, the refugee fraud, they repeat it again and again and again. And it justifies, or is an attempt to justify, what are essentially draconian policies.
Well, I don't buy that. It's not draconian and it's not ominous.
Former Immigration Service head Joel Bissett scoffs at the notion that the reforms are too tough. He says they aren't tough enough.
It's essentially saying, look, when you come here, you're going to be detained until we decide whether you are a refugee or not. It's controversial, of course, because, you know, it, in a sense, begins to penalize people on the boats who are paying smugglers to get here.
Bissett says targeting the people who pay to be smuggled is the only way to stop the problem. But only a small percentage of asylum seekers arrive that way. He says Canada gets more than 30,000 refugee claims a year, and it costs the system billions.
Essentially, they know once they set foot in Canada, they basically are home free. So that's part of the real problem.
And that may be endangering our security too. Bissett says Millennium bomber Ahmed Rassam came to Canada as an asylum seeker before eventually being arrested trying to smuggle a trunkload of explosives into the United States.
Is Canada keeping criminals in this country as a result of the system that is now in place?
Oh, there's no question about it.
So far, 4 people from the Ocean Lady have been arrested and charged with smuggling offenses. And a Sri Lankan man living outside the country has been charged with organizing the Sun Sea's entry to Canada. Bissett says the only way to stop the boats is to send a message that smuggling won't be tolerated.
If people are going to pay smugglers by boat to get here, and they find out they're going to be sent home, they stop coming. And that's the final answer to it. You have to stop the boat from coming.
The theory is simple. Put a law in place that says groups of refugees won't be welcome. Australia is one of the few industrialized countries to try it, and it didn't exactly go as planned.
They imposed mandatory detention on everybody that arrived by boat. The consequence was the number of refugee claimants increased and continued to increase.
Scholler says smuggled migrants typically get their information from the smugglers, and clearly they're not getting the message.
Surprise, surprise. They did not pass on the memos from the Australian Immigration Service, just as they will not pass on all kinds of memos from Citizenship and Immigration Canada.
Let's be blunt. The smugglers are basically the mafia in different countries. These are organized criminal networks that profit from people by putting them in danger.
We sat down with Immigration Minister Jason Kenney to ask why Canada is targeting relatively rare mass arrivals like the Tamil ships.
Why concentrate on something like that when the overall number probably is minor in comparison to the number of people that are coming in overall?
Because it is a dangerous crime that causes the death of thousands of people around the world every year. And I don't want to be Canada's immigration minister if a vessel, a leaky boat coming across the Pacific goes down and lives are lost. Because that's so dangerous, we would say that's a smuggling operation, and those people would be subject to detention for up to a year.
We're talking about the Sun Sea and the Ocean Lady. How much of those claimants do you believe are bogus refugee claimants?
They weren't coming directly from Sri Lanka, and they weren't coming during the war. They were coming after the war, when the UN was actually resettling people back to refugees back to Sri Lanka.
Do you believe that Sri Lanka is a safe country?
No, I mean, I think that, I mean, obviously there are problems in Sri Lanka, problems for the Tamil minority. It's quite possible that there are bona fide refugees coming on some of those vessels, and if they need our protection, they will get it. They won't be sent back to face persecution. That is an absolute commitment that is fully protected in the reforms that we are proposing.
Despite the minister's assurances, the acceptance rate for Sri Lankan refugees has plummeted in recent years, from more than 90% in 2009 to 59% last year. But it's not just Sri Lankan asylum seekers who should be concerned. Records obtained by 16x9 show the decisions made by immigration and refugee board members, and many of them are far below the average acceptance rate of about 40%. Between 2008 and 2010, one member in particular heard 169 refugee claims and turned down every single one. After waiting more than 2 years, Ocean Lady survivors like Kumar and Coogan will soon find out if they'll be allowed to stay in Canada.
You've got your refugee hearing coming up at this point. What do you think about when you think about the possibility of having to go back to Sri Lanka?
I'd be taken into custody, tortured, if not killed, and that worries me.
Immigration consultant Sam Nagendra is a Tamil himself, but he says Canada is now a much less compassionate place than it used to be.
The refugees law has changed dramatically from the time I arrived to now. It's going to be a disaster, and I think it's going to be a shame on Canada. These people are fleeing for their lives here, and you turn them back. You're sending them back to be slaughtered. They are going to be killed.
Coogan just can't believe Canada will allow that to happen.
If I'm sent back, I know that there will be 4 lives at risk, including my life.
Both men are grateful for the protection Canada has already provided them. But even if they're allowed to stay, the new legislation may mean several more years of loneliness, while the lives of their loved ones back home hang in the balance.
I miss my family and worry greatly. I know I'm protected here, but I'm concerned about them. I've fled to protect my family. This is the 3rd year. We're dying within ourselves.
Next on 16 by 9. What it takes to become the best that ever was.
In 2008, Kumar says he and his family were forced to flee their home as the army pushed its brutal war with the rebel Tamil Tigers to an end. To this day, the Sri Lankan government denies targeting civilians, but last year the UN released a report citing credible evidence of deliberate bombing in areas packed with civilians. 16 by 9 obtained this rare video from inside the war zone that appears to show innocent people fleeing the carnage. The sound of the bombers is etched in Kumar's mind.
And when I hear the airplanes flying over here in Canada, I'm reminded of the grim memories.
During the war, captured Tamil Tigers were routinely killed, their bodies publicly displayed.
Here's Carolyn Jarvis.
When nearly 600 Sri Lankan migrants came to Canada aboard battered freighters, their reception was far from that of the typical refugee. Labeled suspected terrorists and criminals, what followed was an intense political debate. On one side, the federal government, which claims Canada has become a doormat for bogus refugee claims and is about to introduce sweeping legislation to change that. On the other, refugee advocates who say Canada is turning away from its tradition of compassion. Tonight, first-hand accounts from people who made that dangerous ocean journey and the controversy that met them on shore.
Kumar says he himself was accused of being an enemy combatant and beaten by government soldiers. So he says he did the only thing he could think of. He escaped to Thailand, got on a ship, along with 75 other desperate people.
At times, the sea was really rough, and I felt saddened that if I die during this journey, my parents would not find my body.
That ship was called the Ocean Lady, and it would soon become very familiar to Canadians. For 45 days, the rusty freighter was pummeled by storms, its human cargo sick, scared, and fearing the end.
Given all the incidents during the journey, I never thought reaching ashore was at all possible.
On October
Tonight on 16 by 9, they escape with their lives.
My family was targeted, and I was threatened with death.
Now the government wants to crack down.
You would say that's a smuggling operation.
Will Canada send them to their deaths?
You're sending them back to be slaughtered.
And then taking to the ice with the best in the world.
I think he's the greatest skater that's ever been.
It's hard to imagine how a sunny, peaceful scene like this could give a man nightmares. But this man, who we'll call Kumar, is constantly haunted by the war he fled and the sea voyage that almost killed him.
Thinking back about the events, I'm not able to recover from the traumatic experience and unable to collect myself and move on.
Kumar is an ethnic Tamil from Sri Lanka, now claiming refugee status in Canada. He asked us to hide his identity to protect his family back home.
To save our lives, we had to flee our home to escape from heavy shelling.
In late 2000,